Welcome to Write in Kansas, Week 11. April is National Poetry Month, and I can think of no better guests today than Kim Horner McCoy. You will recognize a similarity in the last names. She is, of course, my wife and an excellent poet. And let me introduce you. Kim?
Thank you for having me.
Now, you are not here under duress, is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
I'm here of my own free will.
Great. Well, I've got a few questions for you, and I thought a great place to start is this one. Does poetry matter?
Of course poetry matters. We wouldn't be here if poetry didn't matter. Matthew Zapruder, who is a poet and a critic, has a whole book where he talks about this very question, about why poetry matters. And he talks about the reading mind and the way a poem leads you down the page, and eventually you get to politics and you get to ethics. So he concludes that poetry is an ethical act, both the reading and the writing of it. And I agree with that. But I also think that poetry specifically matters in a way different than other writing because it's a little bit of work to work your way down the page of a poem. You need to work out what's happening in the poem, and that helps you engage your mind. It leads you to that ethical question, to that political question through the personal engagement.
So writing poetry is a political act?
Yes.
No matter what kind of poetry you're writing?
Yes, because if we really think about it, everything is politics. Whether you're talking about personal engagement, whether you're talking about personal trauma, eventually everything is political.
What's the earliest poem you can remember reading?
This is an unfortunate question.
Why unfortunate?
Well, because the earliest poem I remember reading, and that I still remember today, is because of an anthology that must have been fourth grade. Teacher asked us to put together. She didn't call it an anthology, of course. And I'm sure that we had class time. I'm sure that we had time in the little tiny library. It was a one-room library. But I did most of my anthology at home. I put together a construction paper cover. I copied out the poems in felt tip pen. And the one I remember is called The Purple Cow by Gillette Burgess from 1895. It's only 4 lines.
And you remember the whole thing?
I never saw a purple cow. I never hoped to see one. But I can tell you anyhow, I'd rather see than be one. That is not a necessarily inspiring poet story, but it is fact. It's the first poem I remember.
When did you know you were a poet?
The true answer to that is always. But I resisted being a poet for a long time. I wanted to be a novelist. I wanted to be William Faulkner or Louise Erdrich or Paul Auster. But it soon became clear to me that I cared more about words than I did about stories, that I cared more about arranging images, about juxtaposing ideas than I did about plot and character.
How long did you continue this resistance?
25 years, probably. A long, long time.
What goes into the making of a poet?
My sort of off the top answer to that is bad luck. And actually, I think that's true.
What do you mean by bad luck?
Anyone who has a fairly comfortable life. They fit in with their friends. They get along with everybody. They're always part of the group, is probably not going to become a poet. And so I don't just mean trauma. If trauma was all it took to be a poet, then everybody who was alive in the last 12 plus months would become a poet. So there's more to it than that. You have to really care about the sounds of words and the way words make meaning.
How much does a sense of place matter with poetry?
It matters a great deal. Whoa.
The wind comes up.
Yes. If you mean, does a poem need to be grounded in a specific locale? Yes, place matters. When you read a poem, you need to feel like you're in a specific place. I've been reading Diane Seuss lately, and I was reading a poem the other day, and the poem is on the surface about an umbrella. It's really about hubs. But she has a line about ants crawling over the unbloomed head of peonies. And when I read that, I am transported back to my childhood, to Memorial Day, to the cemeteries where peonies are. There is no cemetery in that poem, but peonies mean cemetery to me. And so that line in that poem, the way that ants really do that in the concrete actual world, that takes me back to a very specific place.
Does education matter?
Of course education matters.
Well, what kind of education?
You need, if you aspire to become a poet, you need to read all of the poets that have come before you. You need to read their poems. You need to learn how they wrote poetry. Even if you never intend to write a villanelle, for example, you need to study the rhyme schemes of villanelles. You need to understand the ways in which obsession works out in a poem. But you also need to read history, and you read science. You need to study filmmaking. You need to listen to music. You need to learn about carpentry or hot air ballooning or baking bread. Everything that you learn should go into your poetry.
You mentioned passion. Can you give me an example of a poem that has passion in it?
Of all the poems ever written? Or
Can you think of any example?
No, not off the top of my head.
Okay, all right. Who is your favorite poet?
Albert Goldbarth.
Why?
He is, by coincidence, a Kansas poet, but it really is coincidence. I did not know that he lived in Wichita when a beloved former professor introduced his poetry to me. And then I met him in New York State at a conference, and I still didn't know that he lived in Wichita. So that's a coincidence. Why is he my favorite? Because he reads everything. A single poem of his might go from the biography of Darwin to 40 and Times to comic books to science fiction. He puts everything in his poems. He hangs the emotion and the feeling that we expect from poems on a scaffolding of intellect. So you get both the engagements of your mind and your soul in an Albert Goldbarth poem.
Is that a type of passion?
Yes.
What goes into your own work?
Into the composition of a poem or to the content?
Well, Actually, both. I want you to describe the making of a poem. And is there a distinction between the research and then the composition?
Okay. Almost all of my most successful poems, the ones that feel like they are working as you read, begin with an image. It's usually something I see, sometimes something I hear. It might be a ready-made image, a Jackson Pollock painting, the doors of an elevator in a building in Chicago. It may be some fact that I see in the world. At the gravesite of Billy the Kid, there were bullets and pennies scattered across the grave, but there was also a metal cage around the grave. And so that imagery, that scene is where a poem starts for me. But then comes the research. I usually troll around in old newspapers, definitely in dictionaries. I spend a lot of time in the OED, also a lot of time with my favorite dictionary. It's Eric Partridge's Origins. It's a dictionary of etymology. I can't really separate the act of research from the composition, because there will be things that I did not know that I thought about the image until I get into the research. The Billy the Kid poem, until I found the geologic survey about floods in New Mexico, I did not know what the poem was about.
When do you know a poem is finished?
When I just can't bear it anymore.
Do you like reading your own work?
Yes and no.
When yes?
When I'm working on it.
When no?
Every other time after that.
Okay. So you have a chapbook coming out. Could you tell us about that?
Yes, it's called This Bony Cabinet. I have a cover. Oh, there it is. There's the cover.
Okay, hold the cover a little closer to the camera.
To the camera.
Yeah, thank you.
This Bony Cabinet, it's from Finishing Line Press in Georgetown, Kentucky. It will be released July 23rd. It's this summer. 3 of the poems have been published in small journals. The rest of them are all new, some immediately before the pandemic, some in the early months of the pandemic.
Okay. Could you read us a couple of poems from that chapbook?
I could.
Thank you.
Do you want any introduction to these poems, or do you just want me to read them?
No, I kind of think poems are sort of like songs. You just need to
Just read them? Okay.
just read them.
That's my feeling.
Is it?
It is. I hate long explanations about the poem.
I might have some questions afterward, but
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. But yeah, the poem should be itself.
Okay.
All right. So this first one is called Flutter. The day the Fokker died and the Kansas sky dropped alike passengers and pilot onto the flinty Kansas earth, the Rock was famous for his winning record, for his Gipper speech, for lifting the game from the turf to the air. I suppose the pilot, a man named Fry, though you'd never know it if all you'd read was the plaque in the I-35 McDonald's, knew the weight of the fame he ferried. He must have been worried about the weather, the low ceiling, the cold, whether the rain had loosened the glued joints. In the end, it was flutter, motion NASA says that is akin to shimmy in a car, that did them in, that snapped the wing spar, splintering the wood of rib and skin. If you know it's there, the memorial stone points skyward from the ridge, visible through binoculars, faintly gray behind a screen of winter trees. A gravel road spirals up the hill, dead ending at the Heathman place, home of the boy named Easter, among the first to reach the wreck. And if, having hit that country cul-de-sac and turned back and outrun the barking dogs, you stop midway and cut your engine and step from your car. You will see not the least flutter of leaf or feather, hear neither wind nor song.
Thank you. And that poem obviously is about the plane crash that killed Newt Rockney in the 30s.
Correct?
How did you come to that poem?
I was reading William Least Heat Moon's book about Chase County.
Prairie Earth?
Prairie Earth, yes. And he mentions that. And then we happened to stop at the service area on I-35, and there was that display about the crash, and it started from there.
Okay. And you have another poem?
I do. I have Walking Along. And I hope I don't cry when I read this, but it's possible.
Okay.
Okay, so it's called Walking Along. Coyote was walking along. That's how the stories begin. And I know I haven't any right. I'm too white to invoke Coyote. But it's the rhythm. Coyote was going along. And not looking out, not looking both ways, mostly only looking back inside his own eyes. Always a mistake, because then the nowhere opens. And fuck, out comes Twister, Cancer, Rattlesnake. And you can't fucking believe it. Walking along, because you cannot love Cancer, Rattlesnake, Twister, cannot love indifference, cannot believe irrelevance, except Cancer was skulking along. And if I'm too white for Coyote, for Cancer, I'm too alive. Nonetheless, Cancer was going along and not looking out, not looking both ways, mostly only taking, eating, looking for things he could use, always wise, because then the nowhere opens and fill. And we cannot fucking believe it. Then Twister was blowing along. And if for Coyote I'm too white, and for Cancer too alive, for Twister I am definitely too whole. Nonetheless, Twister was going along and not looking back, always looking only one way, definitely only taking, eating, looking for things he could raise, always wise, because then the nowhere opens in Joplin, and I cannot fucking believe it. Finally, Rattlesnake was sliding along, and this is how the story ends. And I know what you're thinking, but you're wrong. It is the rhythm. Rattlesnake was going along and not looking at all, but taking, eating, undulating, making a path only as wide as his long body. Always right, because then the nowhere opens and I am walking along.
Thank you. That poem references some personal tragedies for you.
Yes.
And one of them is the Joplin tornado of 2011.
Yes.
And you were living in Joplin at the time. This is just a few months before we were married.
Correct.
And the tornado, as you often say, ate your town.
Yes, it did.
And then another tragedy is the death of one of our friends, a loss to cancer, our friend Phil Finch.
Yes.
Was this poem a kind of therapy for you? And I apologize to use the word therapy because it makes the poem seem slight, and that's not my intent. Is there a better word for therapy, or was it therapy, or was it something that you simply had to get out? Was it something else?
It's not exactly therapy because I don't feel any better about either of those events than I did before I wrote the poem. Memorial might be a better word, but that's a little off-putting for anyone who wasn't in Joplin, who didn't know our friend Phil. My hope would be that anyone who has had that kind of a personal tragedy, that they will recognize something in that poem that will speak to them. So it's more like communion than therapy, I hope.
I understand. Thank you. What poetry by others are you reading right now?
I mentioned earlier, I think, Diane Seuss. And I've only recently discovered her. I'm appalled that I didn't know about Diane Seuss before. The two books I'm reading now are Still Life with Two Dead Peacocks and a Girl, and Frank Sonnets. And one of the things I love about these poems is that I love the idea of the sonnet. I love the idea of an argument in a poem, that a poem can actually make an argument, that it has this hard turn in the middle of it, the volta. I love that idea. But the minute I walk into that little room, that 14-line room of a sonnet, I just freeze. Something about the rules prevents the poem from happening for me. But Diane Seuss takes the sonnet and she just wrings everything out of it. She writes these long, long lines, and they all have 14 lines, so it's a sonnet in format, and there's always a hard turn in the middle. She goes from one subject to another one, and you think, what is she doing? By the time you get to the end of that poem, it all makes sense, and you can see the way the imagery and the narrative sort of takes hands across the poem and brings you in.
How do you handle the demands of both reading and composition? Do you set aside certain times of the day for both, or do they just both happen all the time?
Yes, that's more accurate, that they both happen all the time.
So you're always working, you're always reading, always thinking about the poems.
Yeah.
Do you compose in your head when you're walking?
Yes, I do. I carry a notebook in the pocket of my walking vest, so that if I see something that I want to remember, I can make a note. If I am obsessively rewriting a line that I know is not quite right, I will do that. And actually the motion of walking will sometimes unlock a poem or a line, and I can fix it.
So better than sitting and staring at a screen?
100 times better.
Do you find that there's a time of day that is best for this type of walking composition?
Early morning. Yes, my dawn patrol is definitely the best time.
As in before daylight?
As in before daylight, yes.
Very good. Is there anything that you would want to talk about that we haven't so far?
The only thing that I can really think of is, if you are an aspiring poet or an aspiring novelist or sculptor or anything else, is to not give up. I've been publishing poems in journals off and on for all of those years that I was resisting being a poet. But this is my first book, so don't give up on what you're working on. It may take some luck, it will definitely take some time, but you will get there.
Kim, thank you so much for taking the time
You're welcome.
to talk with us.